Hey, welcome back everyone. This is just a quick sketch that I was working on, but I wanted to show you an example of some simple shadows. So let me know what you think of today's video, and if you like this format, this content, I'll keep bringing you more. So I just changed my setup, and hopefully this is right for you guys. So I'm trying to get the focus and the lighting just right. So some simple shadow ideas. This can be tricky for us as artists to figure out where to place the shadows. I know I oftentimes just have to guess and then piece it together. But one of the shapes that I use, and I'll show you in action on a little sketch like this, is essentially when I don't know what to do. There's a couple things that I'll cover to show you. First and foremost is I can just simply round out a shape, right? That's probably the simplest approach. You just imagine where the light hits and then where it cannot hit. You know, if this is a spherical object, it can only reach around so far, right? And then if it's on the other side of this object, the shadow will actually look more like this. So I'll just picture like phases of the moon, stuff like that. Right, so something like that. So there's variations of that, but that's just a simple spherical, and then, you know, obviously you render it out from there, whatever way you like to render. I like to do thousands of little lines, but in this case I'm just gonna do something simple to represent it, something like that, like that. There's other rules, like, so if something's more diffused, then generally the shadow or the gradient from the shadow can be more dissipated and faded over a longer area. But if it's abrupt and more specular, then it's going to go from dark to light faster. Okay, so just little rules like that for when you get to the rendering part. I'm going to try to keep this mainly about just the shapes of shadows, but we can elaborate further as we go on. So the other thing to think about is that shapes are not always spherical, right? Like anatomy is not spherical, and that's why if you do the spherical approach, it can make it look like the anatomy is kind of bubbly or something. So what I find that is helpful, and I'll just do, I know I default to arms and chests a lot, but there's a lot of shapes there that we can use, so I'm just going to do a similar rendition of that, because the subject matter isn't really as important as the concepts at this point that I want to show you. So I'll just block in an arm of some kind, you know, nice easy drawing, side arm. And hopefully you understand that you can apply this to all sorts of things. Again, it's more about the concept. So get an arm in here. Look for the silhouette. And just a basic arm pose. Oh, did it off camera, sorry. So like that. All right, and you got all these little shapes, and you can really get into all the, you know, secondary shapes and get super critical, but that's not really the point of this one. So say just like that, we've got the start of our hero-esque character to the side. As we drop in these shapes of shadows, we really want to make sure that we're conveying a feeling that the muscles are compounding forms, that they're not just spherical and they're not just flat or, you know, heading in one direction. There are multiple compounding curves here. Well, one of the ways I found that's a nice way to simplify that, because obviously, like, if you study from life and you try to get these very accurate shadows, it can get a bit confusing, but what you can do is simplify some of the shapes, and I like using kind of this cutting effect. So I'll start with the center deltoid, and so I cut back and forth just a little bit, and then repeat that process, and then cut down this way. And so what this does, at least in my mind's eye, as I'm envisioning this, it gives me something that feels a little bit more compounding versus overly spherical and bubble-like. bubbly, bubble-like. It doesn't mean that I can't use some rounded shapes in here as well. I think that it's more or less just important that you vary up the shapes in general. Like I've seen people get really wild with this concept, and I think it helps. I think that it adds style. I think that it fights the feeling that it's just too awfully even everywhere. You know, that you got to have this feeling that some muscle groups are more dominant and bigger. Like the shoulder is a very dominant muscle group, and the way that it protrudes out from the body, especially in somebody that's very defined, needs a much heavier shadow than, say, even the tricep bicep. You know, so this really does need to be heavier. It needs to have this feeling, like if you go back to our sphere example, that at a certain point the light can't wrap down to the bottom, right? Well, that's the bottom here of the shoulder, bottom of each of these muscle groups, but most dominantly the shoulder. Sometimes you have a character that's got a very big chest, like a Hulk, then you're probably going to want a pretty good sized shadow there. You're going to have these secondary striations and muscle definitions. You'll want a little bit there, but you definitely don't want these anywhere near as heavy as this base shadow, or it's going to read poorly, right? So you need a sort of hierarchy to what you're looking at, I guess. Role of dominance, things like that. Like if everything's got the same, not even just the same shadow size, thickness, weight, whatever, but also the same shape. If it's got the same shape, it's just probably going to lose a little bit of that intensity. So hopefully that makes sense, or you can see that properly. Let's try an example here with the rib cage. So you start with a big, and I'll start spherical on this one just to show you that you can start spherically. I just wouldn't probably end up there on most areas, not all. Some areas you're probably going to want. This is the thing too. Some areas will actually look good with spherical or rounded shadows by comparison and contrast of the other ones having nice angles and compounding bits of definition. So that is something to consider, that you are going to want some of that. Just like anything in art is never an all the way type thing. There's some of this, some of that, balance, variety, all those things really make your work stand out. So if we get over to here, start to use some little triangular or sort of angled cuts into this, and that'll break up this shadow here. You can really play around with this. This isn't going to be entirely correct to the rib cage, but just a representational kind of idea like that. Obliques are over here, but the rectus abdominis, the stomach muscles, are another good example of how sometimes they look really weird when they're overly spherical. In fact, I think what looks better is that there's a bit of a roundedness to the front, a flatness, even if it's ever so slight, to the bottom, and then you start the next one, and it's sort of a stepping process like that. And then you can bring that shadow off as a little bit of a angled oval or something, just a wedge or whatever, like that. And then you bring that shadow up higher as you get lower on the abdominals. And then also you'll see a lot of artists, they had a drop shadow, right? And it does make sense, because if the light's up here pointing down and this angle's away from our view, well, some of that's going to cast a shadow on that next muscle group. So I don't do that part really well, but it's something I'm at least aware of, so I imagine I'll eventually get it. I think that a lot of this stuff you have to sort of understand parts of it for a while, and then you get it, or sometimes you're lucky enough you're just drawing it well, and then you understand it later. That's kind of an odd experience. I guess that's when you really copied that enough from another artist, because you're like, oh, I was already doing that right, but it wasn't until recently I knew why it was right. Like there's so many ways to learn this stuff, and that sometimes we learn just visually, and then other times we have to learn, I guess, theoretically or whatever, like technique-wise. I honestly don't even know which is better. Sometimes I think it's better to just be able to do the thing than actually understand all the concepts. But I don't know. I like studying concepts. I like figuring things out. I think it helps me to memorize it on a deeper level if I understand the underlying concepts a bit better. I do the same thing with anatomy terminology. I know a lot of people are like, oh, you don't need to know the names. It's like, yeah, I kind of do. I kind of like it. I'm sure not everybody needs to know the names, that's for sure, but I feel like it helps. But yeah, so you can take this further and further, and you can just cut into it all sorts of ways, create more striations, more definitions, and I like to draw, obviously shapes going the other direction. Helps reinforce the compounding feeling of this, just like veins help to really push the depth and dimension even further. It just adds that another level of detail that helps explain the forms. And so the obliques, I probably would leave those pretty rounded. And then another thing is just remember that when you get to the high points of certain areas of the work, that you can leave light gaps. That's another neat way to, oh, sorry, I'm putting a shadow on there for my hand. So I changed the light setup where it's actually above my drawing table. It's better, I think, for the most part, but it's I'm having to get used to it. And then there's filling in certain areas, so like this could probably just all be blocked in. I oftentimes leave too much light in certain areas that I shouldn't. Probably did it here as well. Just fill it in. In the wise words of Wally Woods, when in doubt, black it out. So that'll bring this video to a close. I really appreciate you tuning in and watching. Please like, share, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And also comment in the section below. Let me know specifically what you'd like to see more of. I'll do my best to get that on the channel. And as always, keep drawing, keep having fun, and bye for now.